So after Ben Azmanim, a few weeks we were away. Baruch Hashem, we're back in Yerushalayim. And the Shiur today will not be on Parshas HaShavua, but rather in Yonah D'Yoma. We are approaching the end of the Shemitah year. And since the beginning of this year, I've been recording a series of Shiurim for Kol HaLashon on Hilchos Shemitah. I think we recorded somewhat more than 40 Shiurim. But all those Shiurim are Negei Halacha L'Maaseh in Eretz Yisrael, but not in Chutz La'aretz. However, there is one sugya in Shemitah that is relevant in Chutz La'aretz as it is in Eretz Yisrael, and that is Shmitas Kesafim. And all the other halachas begin at the beginning of the Shemitah year, but this halacha is relevant only Miketz Sheva Shonim, at the end of the Shemitah year. So this coming Rosh Hashanah annuls all loans and all debts. Shmitas Kesafim. And anybody that owes money to another party, Im Avra Olav Shnasa Shmita, he is no longer required to pay. And that is the topic we will be discussing today. So the Achronim deal at great length with a fundamental question: how do we define Shmitas Kesafim? What is the proper Hagdorah? The exact definition. Is it Afkata de Malka? Does Shmitas Kesafim mean that the Torah annuls all debt, as if there would be Mechila or Pera'oin? Or is the mitzvah upon the Gavra? And the Torah demands and requires each lender, each and every lender, to be moichel, to forego, to forgive the borrower. Is it a mitzvah on the Gavra? And the nafkamina would be, if the lender is a cotton, cherish, shoita, potam and mitzvahs, his mechila is invalid. He can't be moichel at all. So according to understanding number 2, that it would be gezel. You need to pay this loan. It is still valid. According to approach number 1, it is the Torah that forgives all loans, and therefore, regardless of who the lender would be, Shmitas Kesafim would apply. So many Rishonim clearly use the expression Afkata de Malka. Tshuvas Rashba Chelak Aleph Siman Tov Shin Ayin Hey. Tshuvas Rashba Michoses LeRamban Siman Reish Nun Vav. And the question that Rashba discusses: a person swore, he made a shavua, that I am going to pay the loan that I was given, that I took. And Shemitah year passed. Does he still have to pay because of his oath, because he swore to pay? And the Rashba writes, the person swore to pay a loan that is payable, that he needs to pay, mitzad dinei halavoah. But if Shemitah comes and it's Afkata de Malka and there no longer is a loan, then the Shavua also becomes totally irrelevant. It just evaporates. There is no Shavua because there is no loan. And many Achronim understand from the Rashba, as well the Mordechai in Masechet Gittin Siman Shin Pei, that Afkata de Malka actually means that the Torah annuls all debt. In my opinion, Afkata de Malka really has no real significance. In Bava Metzia, we find the expression of Afkata de Malka dealing with Hilchos Shvias twice, Daf Lametes and Daf Kuvav. So Lametes, we're dealing with a sugya which is appropriate for Masechet Bava Metzia, Nachosim Rutushim and Nachosim Nitushim. A person left his town and traveled to a distant place, and he left real estate. He left houses, he left fields, and we don't know about his whereabouts. What is the Beis Din supposed to do? Does the Beis Din take responsibility? Do they put an apotropos? And the Gemara just asks the question, what is the difference between Nachosim Ritushim with a Reish or Nachosim Nitushim with a Nun? And the Gemara says Nitushim is when a person left his homes, his houses, his properties, not out of his free will. He didn't go to the Alps to have a vacation. He needed to flee. He needed to run away. He was compelled to leave everything behind. And the Gemara proves that the lashon of nitushim is when a person, it is imposed on a person to leave his possessions from shvius, from Shmitas karkois. V'oretz tishmetena v'notashto. That is Avkata de Malka. And Rashi's interpretation of Avkata de Malka is mitzvah samelech. So what this Gemara seems to indicate is when a person does something because he needs to do it, he is forced to do it, that is defined as Avkata de Malka. Even more than that, the Kuvav, the second source, speaks about the Isra of Avodas Oretz, Avodas Alonis, not about Hefker at all. So the first sugya speaks about Va'oretz tishmetena v'netashto, that's the Hefker of Perish Shvius. But the second posuk deals with a prohibition to work the fields and tend to the trees or other fruits. So we're not dealing with a chalois at all, we're not dealing with Hefker. And the Gemara uses the same expression of Kata de Malka, which means whenever something is imposed on a person by the Torah, by a Kodesh Baruch Hu, that is defined as Avkata de Malka, and therefore, I don't think this expression proves either one Agdora or the other. And this is contrary to what many Achronim understood. Regardless of how we define Shmitas Kesafim, it definitely is Avkata de Malka. Person foregoes his monetary rights not out of his free will, but because that is the mitzvah of the Torah, and that is defined as Avkata de Malka. So what about the Svara of the Rashba? The Svara of the Rashba is very simple. When a person swears to pay a loan, what he has in mind, I swear to pay the loan that I am mechuyev to pay. But if Shvius passed, and I no longer am mechuyev to pay, then the Shavua also becomes irrelevant. But that is one mahalach that we find in the Achronim. The other mahalach is the Shiabud HaMamoini, the monetary right is intact. The loan is still a loan. The debt is still a debt. But it is prohibited for the lender to demand that money. So Sefer Yerei Mitzvah Kuf Samech Daled has a Mishnah Rishona and a Mishnah Achrona, a Have Yamina and a Maskana. His first approach is Shmitas Kesafim is entirely on the lender, has nothing to do with the borrower. The borrower needs to pay the loan, and when he comes to pay the lender needs to say, no, I am moichel meshamet anilacha. But if the lender does not say meshamet anilacha, the borrower is obliged to pay that loan. Priyas balchoiv mitzvah. And if he doesn't pay the loan, he is b'chlal loiva rosha v'lo yishalem. The Areim Chozaboy. No, he retracts that opinion because he finds a total contradiction from the Mishnah in Makkos Daf Gimel. I don't want to go into that sugya, it's a bit complicated. His Mishnah Achrona, his Maskana is not very different than his first attitude. It is primarily the lender, not the borrower. The lender is supposed to say, Meshamet ani lacha. You don't need to pay me. And if the lender doesn't say that, it's not like he first thought that the borrower actually needs to pay. The borrower will call the lender to Beis Din, and Beis Din will force the lender to say, Meshamet ani lacha. And the Yeraim writes, it's similar to what we learned twice in Shas Ksubas Peyavov and Churan Kuf Lamed Beis. I explained many times that the obligation of every Beis Din B'Yisrael is twofold, threefold. So one obligation is to do mishpat, judge ben adam l'chaveiroi, ben ish le'ishtoi. The other is Dinei Oinshim, Oinshe HaTorah. So in the modern legal system, there is civil claim, and then there is Mishpat Plili, criminal law. So in civil claims, it is a claimant against a defendant, Ploini against Almoini, Reuven claiming Shimon. criminal law, it is the state against the individual. You broke the law. Lahavdil elef avdolas, it is similar in Beis Din. Beis Din needs to judge ben ish leishte, ben odom lachaveroi, ben adam lishcheno, between neighbors, between partners, between people. But Beis Din is also responsible, claiming in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mechalali Shabbos, boyalei erva, horge nefoshois. And that is similar to criminal law, but it's not the state, it is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But Beis Din has an additional duty, one more obligation, lahamed esadas al tila, to enforce mitzvahs HaTorah, and to impose on people to do their duties. And therefore the Gemara says, and the Yereim says, the Yereim was one of the Bali Atoises, the Belozim Ametz, and he says, if the Malva doesn't say Mishamani, then the Loiva calls the Malva to Beis Din and demands that the Beis Din force him to say Mishamatani, and that is what they do. So that's the opinion of the Yereim. So according to the Yereim, it is clear as daylight, the Chayiv, the debt is not annulled. From the monetary point of view, in Dina Mominis, the loan is a loan, and the loan should be paid. But the lender is required to say, no, you don't need to pay me. Zed varashmito. He's supposed to say, Meshamet ani lacha. So this seems to be somewhat of a dilemma. According to Choshen Mishpat, there is a shiabud. It's a loan. But Yoredei intervenes and says, no. But you have a mitzvah to forego this loan. You have a mitzvah to say, Meshamet ani lacha. However, would this be similar to Ribbis? There's a major discussion regarding the Ritva and Kiddushin Davav. The Ritva seems to say that in the Ribbis, the monetary right is intact. This is a loan. And if the lender collects Ribbis, it's not Gezel. It's not Gezel. The borrower took upon himself this obligation. And the obligation is standing. However, Issa Veheter intervenes. Yoredeya overrides Choshen Mishpat. And Yoredeya says, well, it is a loan. It's an obligation he took upon himself out of his free will. And it is obligating. It's Machayev. But Ribbis is an Isser. And the Chazon Ish twice, Yoredeya Simenayin, Even Ezer Simen Beis, has a philosophical argument with the Pashtus Aritva. And therefore the Chazon Ish says, the Ritva cannot mean this, and he means something else. And he says, a perish rochak b'divrei haritva. So the Chazon Ish's argument is there could be no contradiction and no discrepancy between Choshen Mishpat and Yoredeya. And if you're not allowed to collect Ribbis, you're not allowed to pay Ribbis, then there cannot be a chayiv. It is totally unreasonable, unacceptable. That from the monetary point of view, there is a shiabud, but it is a shibud you could never materialize, because the lender is not allowed to take Ribbis, and neither is the borrower allowed to pay Ribbis. Would it be similar to Shmitas Kesafim? The Chazon Ish compares it, but I think no, two different sugyas. The argument of the Chazon Ish by Ribbis is far more reasonable than by Shmitas Kesafim, because Ribbis hoirosoi v'leidosoi b'cheit. It's not only the lender that is prohibited from collecting Ribbis. The borrower has the same Aveira if he pays Ribbis. And the Aveira includes the Orav and the Eidim. Anybody involved in this bad transaction. Shmitas Kesafim is different. The loan is a proper loan. It was given in goodwill and good faith. It was a mitzvah at the time. And the Shiabud is a Shiabud Gomor. It's just the fact that Shemitah passed. And let us not forget the Mishnah, the very end of Masechet Shvius of Perek Yud. We expect the borrower to pay, regardless of Shmitas Kesafim. He's not obliged to pay, he's not mechuyev to pay, but it is the right thing to do. So it's totally different than Ribbis, which is an Aveira. Here, could even be defined as a mitzvah. So I think the opinion of the Yereim carries weight. And now I go far beyond that. And my own personal opinion, I know this is a chiddush, and not everybody agrees with me, but I wrote this in Minchas Oshan Shviasim in Utes at great length. And my opinion is based on an interesting Gemara in Gittin Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. So Chazal described the process. The borrower is an erlich person. I took a loan. I want to pay. Shvius has passed, but I still want to pay. So he comes to the lender and says, okay, I want to pay back the loan. The lender is obliged to say, Mishamit ani lecha. I forego this loan, I forgive you, you don't need to pay. And if the borrower says, Afal pikein maton ani noisen lecha, then the lender is permitted to take that money. But first he needs to say, Mishamit ani lecha. And then we expect the borrower to say, Afal pikein. Thank you for being so kind, but I do want to pay. And the Chachamim said, Ruach HaChomim noicha heimenu. And then the Gemara says, V'tolelei ad omer hochi. V'tolelei. The borrower could hang him till he says, Afal piken b'meton ani noisen lecha. That is the opinion of Rashi. The Rosh and the Ritvu say no, can't hang him. So the pshat of the Rosh and the Ritvu is Tolelei, Tole be'enov. Tole be'enov is an expression we find in the Gemara, various different sources. He hangs his eyes onto him. Ka'oni be'pesach. The lender is permitted to make the borrower feel uncomfortable, even embarrassed. So he stretches out his hand and he says, my dear friend, I gave you money. I lent you money. And I expect to get that money back. Tolelei, tole be'einav. But Rashi says he hangs him on a tree. So I never really understood what Rashi means. There are many ways to hang a person. So how would the lender hang the borrower to impose on him to say, would he hang him by the neck? You hang a person by the neck, he's not going to say anything. He's not going to say, he's not going to say anything. Maybe he'll have time to say Shema Yisrael, not even Vidui. So is that like you hang people on the gallows? No, it cannot be. You don't kill a person to compel him to say, I want to give back this loan. So does he tie his hands and hang him on his hands and rip his arms out of their sockets? How exactly does he hang a person on a tree till he says, I assume he'll need to have a comfortable chair and then tie something around his waist, tie the chair to the tree. I have no idea exactly what Rashi means. The toilet oise alowaits. But there are other 2 points which are very significant in Rashi. Rashi writes, Imbolach boy tolelei ad omer hochi. And there are 2 different interpretations in Rashi. Imbolach boy. The borrower retracts. What exactly does he retract? One pshat is, well, Chazal deal with the situation. As the loiva comes to the malva and says, I want to pay, the malva says, Mishamatini lecho. And then the loiva responds by saying, oh, so nice of you. I thank you profoundly. And he wants to go home with his money. Then the malva says, no, come back here. You wanted to pay? I'm going to hang you now. I'm going to make you uncomfortable till you say, Afar pikenen metoni noisnocho. That is one pshat. Imbolach zaboy, from his mere will to pay. He came to pay. The other pshat is the loiva already said, Afar piken bemenitoni noisnocho. And after he said that, he is obliged to pay. And it is only then that Torelei ad the Omer Hachi. Why do the other Rishonim, the Rosh and the Ritva, disagree with Rashi? Not because it's Gezel. Just because Tevatel Teire Shvius. If the lender has the right to use violence and to hang the borrower till he pays, then there's no Shmit Kesafim. You totally made the entire mitzvah Shmitas Kesafim totally void, irrelevant. Because lenders will always take advantage of their right and force by violent means on the borrower to pay. And therefore their pshat is toile boyenov, which is not really using force, no violence. But I have a very fundamental question. Bava Basa Memches we learn. Talu v'zaben zvine zvine. If you force the person to sell an item, whatever it is, and you gave him full compensation, he was paid a proper price. B'di'eved, the transaction is valid. Because he got his money's worth, and he said, Roitza ani. However, when you force a person to give a gift, the transaction is invalid because he wasn't compensated for what he gave away. And therefore, even though he said Roitzani, but we know he was forced to say Roitzani, that reflects nothing. It means nothing. He got no compensation, and therefore, it is not valid. If we say Shvius is Afkata de Malka, and the debt is no longer, it's annulled. There is no debt. So when the Loive says, Afar Piken b'matona ninoisen lacho, we really mean a matona. How could you force him to give a matona? You hang him on a tree? You force him to give a matona. That is invalid. It would be gezel. So my kasha is not only on Rashi, but on the Rosh and the Ritva as well, because they don't ask this kasha. The only reason they reject Rashi's pshat is to battle Torah Shvius. Why don't they ask a far more disturbing question? Goes against the Gemara Bava Basa Memches, Talu v'yov metona ein metan toy matona. This question is addressed by two of the greatest Gedolim of our time. Reb Chaim Kanievsky was still in the Shna Sevel, Derech Hamuna Perek Tes, and Reb Moshe Feinstein, Igis Moshe Choshe Mishpat Chelik Beisim in Tesvav. And they both answer a similar answer, to which I, Ania Cotton, totally disagree. So Reb Chaim writes, in that very same sugi, Bava Masa Memches, the Gemara asks a question. When a person needs to bring a korban, and he doesn't want to bring that korban, and Beis Din forces him to bring a korban, it's a kosher korban. Why? Why is that? Why isn't it like talu v'yoiv? And the Gemara says, Nichalei de tehevelei kapora. And then the Gemara asks from get ma'usim. When Beis Din forces a person to give a get, and they hit him, and they torture him, and he says, Roitzani, the get is a valid get. Why? He got no compensation. And the Gemara answers, Mitzvah l'shmoya divrei chachamim. And according to many commentators, this answer, this pshat, this teretz also refers to korbanos. Mitzvah l'shmoya divrei chachamim. So Reb Chaim says, because the Mishnah says, Hamar zachoy b'shviyas, ruach chachamim noiche hemenoi, so the klal, the reasoning, mitzvah l'shmoya divrei chachamim, would apply to our case as well. And even though it's a matana, it is valid. It's a valid transaction because mitzvah l'shmoya divrei chachamim. Reb Moshe says the same, but Reb Moshe goes to a greater extreme. And Reb Moshe says, if Chazal say, ruach chachamim noiche hemenoi, a loive that doesn't pay the loan, she'over of his risk, horosha biliyal v'mutal ha'koisoi. And I wonder, why is he a Rosha? Why is he a Rosha? Ruach HaChomem Noicha Emeno is in no way a Chiyuv. It's very far from being a Chiyuv. Actually, the Mishnah says two different things. Hamach Sechoiv B'Shviyas Ruach HaChomem Noicha Emeno, Kol HaMakayim is the word of Ruach HaChomem Noicha Emeno. Kol HaMakayim is the word of, is even a Matona Moeta She'ein Boi Mechus Ramona. Bava Metzia Memtes is a big sugi about Mechus Ramona. If you promise to give another person a small gift, you need to give that gift. And it's also lachsa boy. You could. In Choshe Mishpat you could. I am not obliged, but it's somewhat an aveda. She'ehen shel chut tzedek v'lav shel chut tzedek. Matona meruba, lechatchila you could regret. and you don't need to stand by your word. V'afar piken Chazal say Ruach HaChomem Noicha Menoi. So Ruach HaChomem Noicha Menoi in no way is a chiyuv. So it is wrong to compare Ma'aseh Choiv B'Shvius to a situation in which Beis Din forces a person to give a get or to bring a korban that he's mechuyev to bring. Because in those two examples, get and korban, it's a chiyuv gamor. And if he doesn't give the get, he is an avarian. When Beis Din paskins one needs to give a get, it's a chiyuv. Person that was over evaded needs to bring a chatos, needs to bring a nosham. It's a chiyuv. And the other point is, it's in Beis Din. It is only in Beis Din that we say mitzvah l'shmoy divrei chachamim. It has nothing to do with the lender forcing the borrower to pay this loan. He's not mechuyev to pay. Shmitas Kesafim is a lechatchila. It's just a level of ruach hachomem noicha mene, like a mekayim is the word of ruach hachomem noicha mene. Not more than that. He's not a rosha. He's not a bilial. Milze de pshita she'osu lahakoisoi. It's a lav of lo yosef lahakoisoi. And therefore, hadre kushya leduchta. This brings me to a conclusion, and this is the punchline. I think leis man de paleg, everyone agrees that from the monetary point of view in Dina Mominis, the loan is intact. Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Tov Ayin Zayin, when he deals with the mitzvah of Shmitas Kesafim, the Lashon of Sefer HaChinuch is la'azov et hachovot. He doesn't write limchol et hachovot. Mechila is a chalois. La'azov means not to forgive, but to forego. The mitzvah of the malva is ignore. You need to tell the loiva, I don't mind if you don't pay. You don't need to pay. Don't feel obliged. Don't feel mechuyev to pay. That is the mitzvah. So it's neither afkata de malke nor a chiyuv ala malve to be moichel. It's not about mechila. The loan is intact. However, Kodesh Baruch Hu turns to the malve, to the lender, and says, you have no right to demand that this loan be paid. And then the Torah turns to the loiva and says, you're not mechuyev to pay. If you wish to pay, Kodesh Baruch Hu will be happy, and the Chachamim will be happy. But from the monetary point of definition, the Chayiv Kayam, it's intact. And therefore, when the Malva was Makayim his mitzvah and he said, Meshameitani, and the Levi says, Afal Piken, from that point on, the Malva is permitted to try to bring it to it that the Levi will pay the loan, because it's still a loan. The loan is intact. It's a loan that could be paid. It's a loan that should be paid. After all, Chazal say, Ruach HaChomem Noicha Himenu. And because the monetary shiabud is intact, that is why the Malva has a right. So the Machlokes Rashi and the other Rishonim is, how far does this right go? According to Rashi, Toilo Yisraelites. But I said before, it must be a lesser degree of violence than hitting a person. So, Toila Oisel Eitz, not by the neck. That's the way you kill people, and it's a Misa Mishuna. You can't hang him upside down by the legs because he'll die in a short time with all the blood filling up his brain. You can't hang him by the arms because the arms will be torn out of their sockets. I really don't know what Rashi means, Toila Oisel Eitz. You sit him on a branch, ask him whether he's comfortable, you tie him up there. Well, it's not very pleasant, sitting up in a tree. It's going to become hot, it's going to become cold. I don't know exactly what Rashi means, but it definitely is a lesser level of violence than hitting a person. Hitting a person is a lav, lo yosef, la koisoi, and the Levi doesn't need to pay. The point I'm trying to make is, But this entire sugi is based on the fundamental assumption there still is a loan. There is debt. You owe him money. So after he is Yotzi Yedei Choiv Dvar HaShmita, Rashi writes, Ve'em bezeh mishum lo yigois, there is no Aveira because Lav Beizin Katuv Alei, Ve'lo mishum Choiv. He's not Tovei and Beizin, Ve'lo mishum Choiv. What do you mean, Lo mishum Choiv? If it's Lo mishum Choiv, then what is it? So the Gemara uses a Loshen B'matona Ninoisen Lachom. And I know that many people will dispute what I say now, but the Gemara calls it a matona. And I say, this is a question the Yoreim already deals with. And the answer is very simple. Whenever a person gives something he is not obliged to give, we call it a matona. Whenever a person gives something out of his will, because I want to give, not because I must give or I'm mechuyev to give, you could call that a matona. So Shmitas Kesafim definitely, if it doesn't dissolve the choiv, but it patters the loiva from paying. Let me make this clear. The loiva is not mechuyev to pay. So the majority opinion is lo kedivra hayareim. The loiva doesn't need to call the malva to Beizin. Beizin should force him to say mishamet eni. No. Shmitas Kesafim is a two-edged sword. The malva is not allowed to demand, and the loiva is potor melishalim. And therefore, the malva, when he tries to make the loiva uncomfortable, he says, I'm not demanding money because I think you're mechuyev. I know you're not mechuyev. I know that you don't have to pay me. But I still think you should pay me. Because I gave you money. And my money is with you. And therefore, I expect you to pay out of your free will. And that is what Rashi means. It's not lo yigois, because the malva doesn't claim that money as if the loiva is mechuyev. The malva says, I know you're not mechuyev, but I still want you to do this. And you should, because Chazal recommend it. And after all, my money is in your possession. The loan is still intact. The loan is a loan, even though the Torah patters the loiva from paying that loan. So I know what I said today seems to be a big chiddush. And whenever I say this in public, it arouses a lot of discussion and controversy. But to me, it's very pashut. And I think this is the way to learn this sugya. So I know that Rambam writes Ovad HaChoiv. So many times I shared with you my feeling. My chedushim are usually built either on shakla v'tarya or on halacha psuka, not on digduka l'shoinus. I'm not troubled by the Rambam's loshen Ovad HaChoiv. The choiv is lost because the loiva doesn't need to pay. The choiv is lost because the malva has no means of forcing the loiva to pay. He can't call him to Beizin. And at the end of the day, if the loiva says, I don't want to pay and I won't pay, there's nothing the malva could do about it. So he hangs him on a tree. I think after some while, he will need to take him off that tree. Or the loiva will call his family members and his good friends, listen, my lender hung me up on this tree, and tell them exactly where the tree is. If he has a cell phone, he's going to use GPS. Come and get me out of here. So, Ovad HaChoiv, because at the end of the day, the malva has no way of forcing the loiva to pay, and the loiva has the right to say, Shmitas Kesafim, I am not paying. I know, Ruach HaChomem noichem, but I'm not in that madrege. So I'm not troubled by the Loshen of the Rambam Ovad HaChoiv. I'm not troubled by the Loshen of the Rashba of Kata the Malka. As I explained at the beginning of the Shiur, this is the way I understand Shmitas Kesafim. So my dear friends, today we didn't even mention Prusbul, and I think before the Shana we'll have another Shiur, probably trying to explain the concept of Prusbul, but that is Sugya number 2. So the two fundamental Sugyas are, on one hand, Shmitas Kesafim, to understand the concept. The other hand, Prusbul. And we didn't even touch the sugya of Prusbul. I think before Rosh Hashanah we'll have another shiur trying to explain the fundamental halachas of Prusbul. So today's Shiur was not associated with a weekly parsha, but rather with Shmitas Kesafim, because we're approaching the end of the Shnas Shemitah. But I would like to address the parsha. Now, many times I tell my friends and Talmidim, whatever we learn Chodesh El should be in the spirit of Chodesh El, in the spirit of Musa, in the spirit of Tshuva. The Ktsois HaChoshen was one of the founders of the world of Lamdis. The Ktsois and the Nesivos were the two great friends and two great Balei Plukta, adversaries with the deepest of love and appreciation, like Talmidei Chachomim, Es Voheiv B'Soifo, Magia L'Dei Ahava. They were two very different personalities. The Nesivos wrote many Sforim, in Drush, in Halacha, in Lamdis. The Ktsois concentrated on his three monumental works. We are exposed to the Ktsois Koyach B'Drush from his introduction to the Shef Shemaitza. A very lengthy, beautiful introduction based on Seder Aleph Beis. And he has a fascinating discussion. And he asks, what's the difference between Anshe Sdoim and Pelegesh Begivo? The story that we find in Torah and in Nevi'im seems to be so similar. The story of Lot and his daughters, the story of the Pelegesh Begivo, same story. So why was Dam totally destroyed? Gofres u'melach sreifa kol haaretza. The people of Giva were punished, but the city wasn't destroyed. Why? Ktsois explains. We find in the Navi Yecheskel that Anshe Sdoim were wicked, and they scorned compassion and love and caring and chemla. They did terrible things. But the Gemara in Sanhedrin explains, in principle, they scorned chemla. They admired force, violence, gezel. The only valid comparison would be the Nuremberg laws, Nazi Germany, Yamach Shemam V'Zichram, systematic murder and annihilation of Jews. Not only Jews, but primarily our people, but also other elements of society, the Slavs, the Russians, the Gypsies. Their philosophy was the philosophy of Dam Ve'esh Ve'Timra Soshan, brutal force, no rachamim, no compassion. In a way, that was Daim. Pelegesh Begiva were terrible people, they did terrible sins. But at least they didn't sanctify brutality and resha. A society that scorns compassion and admires Avel has no right to exist, must be destroyed and eradicated. That was Daim. And that's the difference between Giva and Zdaim. And the Ktsois explains the Rashi at the beginning of our parasha. Shoiftem v'shoitem titn lecha b'chol shorecha kedayu minui dayonim ksherem lahachis es Yisrael ulo yishivon al adamosam. So the Ktsois asks, just by appointing judges that are tzaddikim dayonim ksherem, but you're not listening to what they say. The Ktsois says, even if we don't listen to what they say, but as long as a society understands what's right and what's wrong, they might go astray. But a society that bases its value system on resha must be destroyed. I think the same sentiment and feeling applies to every yochid. So on Chodesh Elul, we turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and we say something very simple and fundamental. Rabboinu Shalom Ritzoineinu Lasois Ritzoinecho. We know what's right, we know what's wrong. Sometimes we go astray, but we know what's right and what's wrong, and we want to be good in the depths of our hearts. Ritzoineinu Lasois Ritzoinecho. We have a lot of alibis, we have a lot of terutzim. Mi ma'akev. Sa'oi shebe'usa, shi'abud malchiyois. But look into our hearts. We want to be good. And we know what it means to be good. We know the Torah you gave us. We're familiar with the mitzvahs. We want to be good. We hope to be good. And we promise to work on it. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is forgiving. He gives us the time. He's understanding. Ritzoineinu lases ritzonecho. So please, let us live. Kedayu minui shoiftem ksherem lahachis es Yisrael ulo yeshivan al adamos. So I gave you one pshat from the Ktsois HaChoshen, the greatest of Lamdonim. Now another pshat from the greatest of Hasidim, the Kedushas Levi Reb Levi Yitzchok Mebardichov, on the very same pasuk. Shoiftem v'shoitem titin lacho b'chol she'orecho. Says the Kedushas Levi, b'chol she'orecho means shari shamayim, beizin shalamala. So when you call to court down here on this world, you can't choose who's going to judge you. You can't come to the courtroom and say, I have an uncle that's a judge, and I would like him to be my judge, to deal with my case, because I know he loves me, and I love him. We have a very special relationship. Could you please have him take on my case? You know, you're going to be laughed at, and your uncle, he's going to be the only one that'll never touch your case. You cannot choose who your judge is going to be, and you don't get to choose your jury either. You just need to be lucky. And you have no one to rely on. But on Beizin Shalmalo, it is different. You are the one to determine who and how you will be judged. Says the Kedushas Levi, Mida keneged Mida. B'mida she'oda moided in loimen hashamayim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at us, the way we act and react and interact with our friends. And that is the way we will be judged. Shabbos Kuf Nun Gimel, the Gemara says, Kol ha'maracham al habriyas marachmem olav min hashamayim. If you have compassion on other people, marachamem olav min hashamayim. And Rosh Hashanah Yud Zayin, and in Masechet Sanhedrin as well, the Gemara says, Kol ha'mavir al midosav mavirim lo al kol pshuav. If you are mevater, if you know how to forgive, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will forgive you. So in Shemaim, it's up to you, the way you will be judged, and by whom you will be judged. If you have rachmanas and compassion and care for others, and forgive, and you know how to forgive, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be forgiving to you, and that's the way you will be judged. Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. An interesting pshat shared by the Nefesh HaChaim and the Kedushas Levi. Nefesh HaChaim is the greatest disciple of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, Reb Chaim of Volozhin. And Kedushas Levi is Reb Levi Yitzchok Mebardichov. Tzel, in Lashon Kodesh, has two different interpretations. It's shade and it's shadow. Both are called tzel. So Pashtis, Kavonas HaKos of Hashem Tzilcha, Kodesh Baruch Hu shades over us. We sit in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's shade. He safeguards us. We're sitting in His shade and He protects us from the heat, from the rain, from the cold, with love and compassion. That's the simple pshat in Hashem Tzilcha. But Reb Chaim of Volozhin and Reb Levi Yitzchok Mebardichov offer a different interpretation. Shade means shadow, and your own shadow. So, if you're sitting out in sunlight, you make a shadow, you have a shadow. And whatever you do, the shadow will do exactly the same. And as tricky and fast as you are, you could never out-trick your shadow. Every emotion, everything you do, He will do after you. Hayoshev b'mroim HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the heavens looks at you, whatever you do, and whatever way you interact with others. Mido keneged mido. That is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu will judge you. So, my dear friends, the greatest gula in Chodesh Elul is Kol ha'maver al medoisav. It's just beyond me how people could be angry, how people could be makbed in Chodesh Elul, the Yomim Neroim, and they're not aware they might be causing tragedy to themselves, to their families, because these are days of judgment. The way you judge others is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu will judge you. So let us all take upon ourselves, at least in these days, to be forgiving, to be caring, to have rachmanis, to give tzedakah, to care for others. Kol ha'maracham al habriyos, marachamim olav min hashamayim. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu should judge us, berachamim, bechemlo, b'machila, v'slicha v'kapora, and we should all be zoichem to Hashanah Toiva Mesuka, and Eksiva v'chasim Toiva lanu, v'lakol beis Yisrael. Have a beautiful Shabbos.